August 15, 1943. The Pacific sun beats down mercilessly on the flight deck of USS Essex as Lieutenant Commander James Mitchell watches his fuel gauge with the kind of anxiety that keeps fighter pilots awake at night. His F6F Hellcat carries 250 gallons of aviation gasoline, enough for maybe 3 hours of combat patrol. The Japanese airfield on Rabbel lies 400 miles away. Round trip with any meaningful time over target means pushing his fuel margins to the breaking point. One extended dogfight, one navigation error, one headwind stronger than forecast, and he'll be swimming in shark-infested waters. This is the nightmare that haunts every carrier pilot in 1943. Not enemy fighters, not anti-aircraft fire, but the tyranny of fuel capacity. American aircraft are faster, better armed, and more heavily armored than their Japanese counterparts. But speed and firepower mean nothing if you can't reach the target and return home. The mathematics are brutal and unforgiving. A fully loaded Hellcat burns 55 gallons per hour at cruise power. Push the throttles forward for combat, and consumption doubles. Pilots learn to fly with one eye on the enemy and one eye on the fuel gauge, knowing that every minute of battle brings them closer to a watery grave. What Lieutenant Commander Mitchell doesn't know, what nobody in the Pacific Fleet knows, is that 7,000 miles away, in a cramped laboratory at the Naval Research Facility in Philadelphia, a 34-year-old chemist named Dr. Heather Willauer is about to solve the most critical limitation facing American naval aviation. Her solution will be so revolutionary, so disruptive to the established fuel industry that powerful forces will spend decades trying to bury it. But first, they'll have to understand what she's discovered in the depths of ordinary seawater. Dr. Heather Willauer never intended to change naval warfare forever. Born in Cleveland, Ohio in 1975, she studied analytical chemistry at Ohio State University, drawn to the precise, methodical nature of molecular analysis. While her classmates pursued careers in pharmaceuticals or materials science, Willauer found herself fascinated by energy systems, particularly the chemistry of combustion. Her doctoral thesis examined catalytic conversion processes, the art of transforming simple molecules into complex compounds through carefully controlled chemical reactions. When the Naval Research Laboratory recruited her in 2005, Willauer's assignment seemed routine: study alternative fuel sources for naval applications. The Navy was concerned about fuel supply vulnerability. Every gallon of aviation gasoline had to be shipped thousands of miles from refineries to forward bases, then transported by vulnerable tanker ships to carrier battle groups. A single submarine attack on a fuel convoy could cripple an entire fleet's operations. The admirals wanted options, alternatives, anything that could reduce their dependence on petroleum supply chains stretched across hostile oceans. Willauer's early research followed conventional paths: biofuels derived from algae, synthetic hydrocarbons created from captured carbon dioxide. Each approach showed promise in laboratory conditions but collapsed when subjected to the harsh realities of mass production and military logistics. Algae biofuels required massive cultivation facilities. Synthetic fuel production demanded enormous amounts of electrical power and exotic catalysts. Every solution created new problems, new vulnerabilities, new dependencies. The breakthrough came during what should have been a routine experiment in September 2012. Willauer was testing a new electrolytic process for extracting hydrogen from seawater, part of a broader research program into hydrogen fuel cells for submarine applications. The process used her proprietary electrolytic cation exchange module, a device that applied precise electrical currents to seawater to separate hydrogen atoms from water molecules. But something unexpected happened. Along with hydrogen, the system was also extracting carbon dioxide dissolved in the seawater itself. Carbon dioxide concentration in seawater is approximately 140 times higher than in atmospheric air. Ocean water naturally absorbs CO2 from the atmosphere, creating a vast reservoir of dissolved carbon that marine life depends on for photosynthesis. Willauer realized she wasn't just looking at a byproduct of hydrogen extraction. She was looking at the raw materials for synthetic fuel production. Hydrogen plus carbon dioxide, combined under the right conditions with the right catalysts, could produce complex hydrocarbon chains identical to petroleum-based aviation fuel. The chemistry was elegant in its simplicity. Traditional fuel production starts with crude oil, a mixture of hydrocarbons formed over millions of years through geological processes. Willauer's process would create the same hydrocarbon molecules in a matter of hours, using nothing but seawater, electricity, and iron-based catalysts. The fuel would be chemically identical to conventional aviation gasoline, requiring no engine modifications, no infrastructure changes, no retraining of maintenance crews. Ships could literally make their own fuel while at sea, but the implications terrified the petroleum industry. Every major oil company had billions of dollars invested in refineries, tanker fleets, and distribution networks built around the assumption that hydrocarbons could only come from underground deposits. Villauer's process threatened to make their entire infrastructure obsolete. Overnight fuel from seawater would eliminate a technology that could produce aviation convoys and fuel storage, the need for petroleum imports, oil tanker facilities. Nations with access to seawater and electrical power could achieve complete energy independence for their military forces. The initial test results were staggering. Villauer's process achieved CO2 extraction efficiency of 92%, while simultaneously producing hydrogen through conventional water electrolysis. The iron-based catalyst she developed could convert the extracted gases into liquid hydrocarbons with 60% efficiency, producing longer-chain molecules suitable for aviation fuel while minimizing unwanted methane byproducts. Early cost projections suggested the fuel could be produced for between $3 and $6 per gallon, competitive with conventional aviation gasoline when transportation and logistics costs were factored in. Pentagon officials who reviewed Villauer's preliminary findings in late 2012 recognized immediately that they were looking at a potential game-changer for military logistics. The ability to produce fuel independently of petroleum supply chains would eliminate one of the military's greatest vulnerabilities. Carrier battle groups could operate indefinitely in remote areas without requiring fuel replenishment from vulnerable tanker convoys. Forward bases could be established anywhere with access to seawater and power generation, creating new strategic possibilities for force projection and sustained operations. The first proof-of-concept demonstration took place on April 2, 2014 at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C. Villauer and her team had produced several gallons of synthetic fuel using their seawater extraction process, creating a clear liquid that looked and smelled identical to conventional aviation gasoline. To test its performance, they chose a symbolic aircraft, a radio-controlled replica of the legendary P-51 Mustang, flown by the Tuskegee Airmen during World War II. The choice was deliberate. The P-51 had been powered by 100-octane aviation fuel that gave American pilots a decisive advantage over German aircraft running on lower-grade gasoline. The model aircraft's unmodified two-stroke internal combustion engine started immediately when fed Villauer's synthetic fuel. It ran smoothly, producing normal power output and exhaust emissions. The flight demonstration lasted 45 minutes, with the engine performing flawlessly throughout the entire test. Gun camera footage captured every moment as the tiny Mustang climbed, dove, and maneuvered exactly as it would have on conventional fuel. The symbolism was unmistakable. American technological innovation had once again produced a fuel that could give military forces a decisive advantage over their adversaries. News of the successful demonstration should have triggered immediate military interest and accelerated development funding. Instead, it marked the beginning of a bureaucratic and political battle that would last for years. Petroleum industry lobbyists descended on Capitol Hill, warning about the economic disruption that widespread adoption of seawater fuel could cause. Environmental groups raised concerns about the massive electrical power requirements for large-scale production. Defense contractors worried about the impact on existing fuel supply contracts worth billions of dollars annually. The resistance came from unexpected directions. Even within the Navy, traditional procurement officers questioned whether revolutionary fuel technology was worth the risk of disrupting established supply relationships. Oil company executives who had spent decades building refinery capacity and distribution networks saw Villauer's process as an existential threat to their business model. The classified briefing room at the Pentagon fell silent when Admiral Robert Burke, Chief of Naval Operations, finished reading Villauer's technical report. Around the polished mahogany table sat representatives from every major defense contractor, oil company executive, and congressional liaison who controlled military fuel procurement. The numbers on the page told a story that none of them wanted to hear. Seawater-derived fuel could be produced at forward operating bases for less than half the cost of conventional aviation gasoline when transportation expenses were included. But cost wasn't the real issue. Control was. ExxonMobil's military contracts division had spent 15 years building relationships with Pentagon procurement officers. Shell Oil maintained exclusive supply agreements with 3 major naval bases. BP held long-term contracts worth $2.8 billion for Pacific Fleet operations. Villauer's technology threatened to make every one of these arrangements irrelevant. Why pay premium prices for petroleum-based fuel shipped halfway around the world when ships could manufacture their own supply using nothing but seawater and electrical power? The petroleum industry's response was swift and sophisticated. Rather than directly opposing the technology, they questioned its practical implementation. Industry-funded studies highlighted the massive electrical power requirements for large-scale fuel production. A single aircraft carrier would need approximately 250 megawatts of additional electrical generation capacity to produce meaningful quantities of synthetic fuel. Even nuclear-powered ships lacked sufficient electrical output for continuous fuel production during combat operations. Environmental groups provided unexpected opposition from a different angle. The Sierra Club published a detailed analysis claiming that seawater fuel production would require enormous amounts of electrical power, potentially increasing carbon emissions if that electricity came from fossil fuel power plants. Greenpeace researchers calculated that widespread adoption of the technology could disrupt marine ecosystems by removing dissolved carbon dioxide that ocean organisms depend on for survival. These concerns weren't entirely fabricated. Willauer's process did require substantial electrical input, roughly 600 kilowatt-hours per gallon of fuel produced. Large-scale implementation would demand significant infrastructure investments in power generation and distribution systems. But the critics conveniently ignored the strategic advantages of fuel independence and the long-term environmental benefits of reducing petroleum consumption. Congressional hearings in the summer of 2014 revealed the depth of opposition Willauer's innovation faced. Davidson, Senator James of Texas, whose state hosted 3 major oil refineries, questioned whether taxpayer money should fund research that could eliminate American jobs in the petroleum industry. Representative Maria Santos of Louisiana worried about the economic impact on coastal communities dependent on oil and gas operations. The hearing room filled with petroleum industry executives nodding gravely as elected officials voiced their concerns about disrupting established economic relationships. But Willauer had allies in unexpected places. General Mark Harrison, commander of Marine Corps Aviation, testified that fueled the greatest logistics represent vulnerability facing forward-deployed forces. Every gallon of aviation fuel required an average of 7 gallons of other petroleum products to transport it from refineries to combat zones. Fuel convoys presented high-value targets for enemy forces. The ability to produce fuel locally would eliminate these vulnerabilities while extending the operational range of military aircraft. The Marine Corps had particular interest in Willauer's technology because of their expeditionary mission requirements. Marine air wings routinely deployed to remote locations with limited infrastructure support. Establishing fuel production capabilities using portable seawater processing equipment could enable sustained operations in areas where conventional fuel resupply was impossible or prohibitively dangerous. Captain William Chen, a Marine Corps logistics officer who had served 3 combat deployments in Afghanistan, provided testimony that cut through the political rhetoric. His squadron had lost 2 fuel convoys to improvised explosive devices during a single deployment. Each attack killed American service members and disrupted flight operations for days while alternate supply routes were established. Local fuel production would eliminate these casualties while improving operational flexibility. Despite compelling military testimony, the Congressional Committee voted to limit funding for seawater fuel research to basic laboratory studies. Full-scale development and testing would require approval from the House Armed Services Committee, where petroleum industry influence was strongest. The official justification cited budget constraints and competing research priorities. The unofficial reason was pressure from oil company lobbyists who viewed Willauer's work as a direct threat to their market dominance. The Navy's response was to classify most of Willauer's research results, effectively preventing public discussion of the technology's potential. Classification served dual purposes. It protected potentially valuable military technology from foreign intelligence services while also shielding the petroleum industry from public pressure to support alternative fuel development. Citizens couldn't demand action on technology they weren't allowed to know about. The classification couldn't hide the fundamental breakthrough Willauer had achieved. Her process represented a paradigm shift from extractive to generative fuel production. Instead of finding and refining petroleum deposits, military forces could create fuel on demand using abundant seawater resources. The strategic implications extended far beyond simple cost savings to fundamental questions of energy security and military independence. Foreign militaries began investigating similar technologies. Chinese naval researchers published papers on electrochemical seawater processing systems. Russian scientists experimented with alternative catalyst formulations for carbon dioxide conversion. European defense contractors filed patents for portable fuel production equipment. The window of American technological advantage was closing, while domestic political battles prevented full development of Willauer's innovation. The most frustrating aspect for military planners was watching potential adversaries pursue the same technology that American bureaucrats were effectively blocking. Intelligence reports indicated that at least 4 foreign nations had active research programs programs focused on seawater-derived fuel production. Some of these programs appeared to be based on publicly available information from Villauer's early research papers, published before classification restrictions were imposed. By 2016, the situation had reached an absurd stalemate. American military forces continued paying premium prices for petroleum-based aviation fuel while possessing the technology to produce superior alternatives at lower cost. Villauer's team maintained their research program with minimal funding, making incremental improvements to catalyst efficiency and system reliability. But large-scale testing and operational deployment remained blocked by political and economic interests that viewed energy independence as a threat to established profit margins. The breakthrough that changed everything came not from Washington politics, but from an unexpected source in the South China Sea. Chinese naval forces had been conducting increasingly aggressive patrols near disputed islands, challenging American freedom of navigation operations. During one confrontation, a Chinese destroyer demonstrated unusual operational endurance, remaining on station for weeks longer than conventional fuel supplies should have allowed. American intelligence analysts studying satellite imagery and signal intercepts reached a disturbing conclusion. The Chinese vessel appeared to be operating some form of onboard fuel production system, possibly based on seawater processing technology similar to Villauer's research. If confirmed, this would represent a significant shift in naval capabilities, allowing Chinese forces to maintain extended deployments without vulnerable fuel resupply operations. The intelligence report landed on Admiral Burke's desk on a Monday morning in October 2016. By Thursday afternoon, he was sitting across from Villauer in her Philadelphia laboratory, asking how quickly her team could scale their technology for operational testing. The intelligence briefing that changed everything took place in a windowless conference room deep within the Pentagon's E-ring. Admiral Burke spread classified photographs across the mahogany table, satellite images showing Chinese naval vessels operating in patterns that defied conventional fuel logistics. Ship formations that should have required constant tanker support were maintaining station for unprecedented durations. Signal intercepts suggested the Chinese had achieved something American bureaucrats had spent 3 years blocking. Villauer studied the images with the practiced eye of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at. The Chinese destroyer's unusual exhaust signatures, the modified deck structures visible in high-resolution photography, the absence of fuel transfer operations during extended deployments. Every detail pointed to the same conclusion. Foreign military forces were operationally deploying technology that existed in American laboratories but remained trapped by domestic political paralysis. The Admiral's question cut through years of bureaucratic stagnation with military directness. How long would it take to build a full-scale prototype system? Villauer had been waiting for this moment since 2014. Her team had continued refining the catalyst formulations and improving system efficiency despite limited funding. The basic technology was ready. What they needed was authorization to build beyond laboratory scale. 6 months, she replied, assuming full funding and priority access to materials. Maybe 4 if we can work around the clock. Burke nodded grimly. The Chinese had apparently given his forces a deadline they couldn't ignore. American technological superiority in naval aviation depended on maintaining the fuel logistics advantage. If adversaries could produce their own aviation fuel while American forces remained dependent on vulnerable supply chains, the strategic balance would shift decisively. Within weeks, Villauer's laboratory transformed into something resembling a classified weapons development program. Military contractors arrived with specialized equipment and security clearances. The Navy's best engineers joined her team, bringing decades of experience in shipboard systems integration. Funding appeared from black budget allocations that bypassed congressional oversight entirely. The same petroleum industry executives who had spent years blocking her research suddenly found themselves excluded from meetings they weren't cleared to attend. The prototype system they built occupied an entire warehouse at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. Massive electrolytic processing units stood alongside catalyst reaction chambers and fuel purification systems. The scale dwarfed anything Villauer had worked with before. Instead of producing gallons for laboratory testing, this system was designed to generate thousands of gallons daily, enough to fuel squadron operations during extended deployments. The first full-scale test took place on March 15, 2017. Seawater pumped directly from the Delaware River entered the processing system at dawn. By afternoon, clear liquid fuel was flowing from the output manifolds at a rate of 50 gallons per hour. Chemical analysis confirmed that the synthetic fuel met or exceeded all specifications for military aviation gasoline. Octane ratings matched premium petroleum products. Energy density equaled conventional jet fuel. Combustion characteristics were identical to standard aviation gasoline. But the real test came when they fired up the aircraft engines. A Navy FA-18 Super Hornet, its fuel tanks drained and refilled with Willowa's synthetic fuel, sat on the runway at Naval Air Station Patuxent River. The pilot, Commander Sarah Chen, had volunteered for what everyone understood was a career-defining moment. Either the fuel worked as advertised, or she would be attempting an emergency landing with experimental propellant in her fuel lines. Chen hit the ignition switches. Twin F414 engines spooled up normally, producing the familiar whine of military turbo fans reaching operational temperature. All engine parameters showed green. Fuel flow rates matched specifications. Exhaust gas temperatures remained within normal limits. The aircraft was ready for flight testing with fuel extracted from ordinary seawater just hours earlier. The test flight lasted 2 hours and covered every performance regime from low-speed handling to supersonic dash capabilities. Chen pushed the Super Hornet through high-G maneuvers, emergency power settings, and fuel-critical scenarios that would stress-test the synthetic fuel under extreme conditions. The engines responded flawlessly throughout the entire flight envelope. Fuel consumption matched baseline data from conventional aviation gasoline tests. Performance characteristics were indistinguishable from standard petroleum-based fuel. When Chen landed and shut down, ground crews immediately began detailed engine inspections. Fuel system analysis revealed no contamination, no unusual wear patterns, no indication that the engines had been running anything other than premium aviation fuel. The synthetic fuel had performed identically to conventional gasoline while being produced entirely from seawater and electrical power. News of the successful flight test sent shockwaves through both military and civilian fuel industries. Petroleum executives who had spent years dismissing seawater fuel as laboratory fantasy suddenly faced the reality of operational military aircraft powered by technology that could eliminate their market overnight. Defense contractors scrambled to understand how quickly the Navy planned to deploy the new fuel production systems. Foreign intelligence services worked frantically to obtain technical details about American seawater processing capabilities. The strategic implications became clear during classified briefings at the highest levels of government. American naval forces could potentially achieve complete fuel independence for aviation operations. Aircraft carriers could manufacture their own aviation fuel while underway, eliminating the vulnerability of fuel tanker convoys. Forward operating bases could be established anywhere with access to seawater and electrical power, creating new possibilities for sustained military operations in contested regions. But the technology also raised uncomfortable questions about energy independence that extended far beyond military applications. If seawater could be converted into aviation fuel efficiently enough for military use, civilian applications weren't far behind. Commercial airlines spending billions annually on petroleum-based jet fuel would demand access to cheaper synthetic alternatives. The entire petroleum industry's business model faced potential disruption from technology that could produce identical fuel products without requiring crude oil extraction or refinery operations. Willowa found herself at the center of discussions that went far beyond chemistry and engineering into fundamental questions of economic policy and national security strategy. Her laboratory breakthrough had accidentally created a weapon more powerful than conventional explosives or guided missiles. She had developed the ability to eliminate petroleum dependence entirely, threatening industries worth trillions of dollars while potentially reshaping global power relationships based on energy control. The classified nature of ongoing development meant that public discussion of the technology remained limited to carefully managed press releases about research progress. Media reports described seawater fuel as an interesting laboratory experiment requiring years of additional development before practical application. The reality was that operational systems were already being integrated into selected naval vessels for extended testing under combat conditions. Military planners began developing scenarios for how seawater fuel production could change operational doctrine. Carrier battle groups equipped with onboard fuel synthesis capabilities could maintain station indefinitely without logistical support. Marine expeditionary units could establish self-sufficient forward bases using portable fuel production equipment. Air wings could operate from remote locations previously considered unsustainable due to fuel supply limitations. The first operational deployment of Willowa's technology occurred during a classified mission in the Western Pacific. During the summer of 2017, a modified destroyer equipped with experimental fuel production systems conducted extended patrols in disputed waters, testing whether seawater-derived aviation fuel could sustain helicopter operations during real-world conditions. The results exceeded expectations. Aircraft performance remained optimal throughout the deployment, while fuel costs dropped to a fraction of conventional resupply expenses. Foreign militaries monitoring American naval operations began noticing unusual patterns that suggested significant changes in fuel logistics capabilities. Ships that should have required frequent tanker support were maintaining operational tempo without visible resupply operations. Aircraft sortie rates increased beyond levels sustainable with conventional fuel storage capacities. Intelligence analysts concluded that American forces had achieved some form of breakthrough in fuel independence technology. The response from potential adversaries was predictable and concerning. Chinese research programs accelerated development of similar seawater processing systems. Russian naval engineers published papers on electrochemical fuel synthesis using ocean resources. Iranian scientists investigated catalyst formulations for converting seawater into aviation fuel. The window of American technological advantage was narrowing as foreign powers rushed to develop their own versions of Wilauer's breakthrough. By early 2018, the situation had evolved into a technological arms race focused on energy independence rather than weapons systems. Nations were competing to achieve fuel self-sufficiency that could eliminate strategic vulnerabilities associated with petroleum dependence. The country that mastered seawater fuel production first would gain decisive advantages in sustained military operations while potentially disrupting global energy markets. Wilauer's role in this competition had evolved from research chemist to strategic asset. Her understanding of catalyst chemistry and system integration made her one of the few people capable of optimizing seawater fuel production for large-scale military applications. The Navy assigned her a security detail typically reserved for weapons designers, recognizing that her knowledge represented a national security priority requiring protection from foreign intelligence services. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved in the program. Technology that had been dismissed as impractical and blocked by domestic political interests had become a classified strategic capability once foreign adversaries demonstrated similar research progress. American bureaucrats who had spent years protecting petroleum industry profits suddenly found themselves racing to deploy the same technology they had previously opposed. The breakthrough that finally forced deployment came from an unexpected source. On September 12, 2018, Iranian naval forces captured a disabled American reconnaissance drone in the Persian Gulf. The aircraft had been conducting routine surveillance when engine failure forced an emergency landing on Iranian territorial waters. What Iranian engineers discovered when they examined the drone's fuel system changed the strategic calculus overnight. The fuel samples extracted from the drone's tanks weren't petroleum-based aviation gasoline. Chemical analysis revealed synthetic hydrocarbons with molecular signatures consistent with electrochemical synthesis from seawater. Iranian scientists, many of whom had studied at American universities before international sanctions limited academic exchange, immediately recognized the implications. The Americans weren't just researching seawater fuel in laboratories. They were operationally deploying it on military aircraft, conducting missions in hostile territory. Iranian intelligence services quickly shared their findings with Chinese and Russian counterparts. Within days, classified intelligence reports were circulating through foreign military establishments, confirming what many had suspected for months. American forces had achieved practical fuel independence through technology that could revolutionize military logistics while potentially destabilizing global energy markets. The Iranian revelation triggered immediate responses from multiple foreign governments. Chinese naval research programs received emergency funding increases totaling $800 million. Russian energy ministries convened crisis meetings to assess the potential impact on petroleum export revenues. European defense contractors began accelerated development of similar technologies, recognizing that fuel independence could become a decisive military advantage in future conflicts. Admiral Burke found himself briefing the Secretary of Defense on a situation that had spiraled beyond simple technology development into questions of national security strategy. Foreign adversaries were aggressively pursuing American innovations, while domestic political resistance continued limiting full-scale deployment. The United States faced the absurd possibility of losing technological superiority in systems developed by American researchers using American funding at American laboratories. The classified briefing room filled with tension as Pentagon officials grappled with strategic implications they hadn't anticipated. Seawater fuel technology represented more than alternative energy sources. It threatened to eliminate petroleum as a strategic resource entirely, potentially rendering oil-rich nations economically irrelevant while shifting global power balances toward countries with advanced electrochemical processing capabilities. Secretary of Defense James Harrison listened grimly as intelligence analysts described foreign research progress. Chinese scientists had apparently solved catalyst efficiency problems that American researchers were still refining. Russian engineers Americas had developed portable fuel production systems suitable for deployment at remote military bases. Iranian technicians were reverse engineering American synthetic fuel samples to develop their own production capabilities. The strategic assessment was stark and unforgiving. America's technological lead in seawater fuel production was measured in months, not years. Foreign powers were rapidly closing the gap, while American forces remained dependent on vulnerable petroleum supply chains that adversaries could disrupt through conventional military action or economic manipulation. Harrison's decision was immediate and decisive. Operation Deep Current would receive unlimited funding and absolute priority for resource allocation. Willauer's technology would be deployed across the Pacific Fleet within 18 months, regardless of petroleum industry objections or congressional budget concerns. The alternative was watching foreign militaries achieve fuel independence, while American forces remained strategically vulnerable to supply line attacks. The mobilization that followed resembled wartime production programs from previous decades. Naval shipyards received massive contracts to retrofit vessels with seawater fuel production systems. Defense contractors hired thousands of engineers to scale manufacturing of catalyst systems and electrochemical processing equipment. Universities with relevant research capabilities found themselves managing classified programs funded through black budget allocations. Willauer's team expanded from dozen researchers to over 300 specialists working around-the-clock shifts. The Philadelphia Navy Yard became the center of a classified industrial complex focused entirely on perfecting seawater fuel technology for operational deployment. Security measures rivaled those protecting nuclear weapons programs, recognizing that fuel independence could prove as strategically significant as nuclear capability. The first operational fuel production ship, USS Independence, completed sea trials in March 2019. The modified destroyer carried experimental systems capable of producing 2,000 gallons of aviation fuel daily, while maintaining normal combat capabilities. Initial testing exceeded all performance projections. Fuel quality matched premium petroleum products, while production costs remained below $3 per gallon, including electrical power generation expenses. But the real test came during extended deployment operations in the South China Sea. USS Independence maintained station for 89 consecutive days without external fuel resupply, supporting helicopter operations and providing aviation fuel for visiting aircraft throughout the entire deployment. Chinese naval forces monitoring American operations noted the unusual endurance with growing concern about shifting strategic capabilities. The fuel produced by Independence powered over 400 helicopter sorties during the deployment, supporting reconnaissance missions, logistics operations, and search and rescue activities that would normally require constant fuel convoy support. Aircraft performance remained optimal throughout the extended operations, while fuel costs dropped to approximately 40% of conventional petroleum-based aviation gasoline. Military pilots who flew missions using seawater-derived fuel reported identical performance characteristics compared to conventional aviation gasoline. Engine response, fuel consumption rates, and operational capabilities showed no measurable differences. The synthetic fuel performed flawlessly across all flight regimes from low-altitude reconnaissance to high-speed interception missions. Ground crews responsible for fuel handling and aircraft maintenance initially approached the synthetic fuel with understandable skepticism. Decades of experience had taught them that alternative fuels often created unexpected problems with engine performance, fuel system compatibility, or maintenance requirements. But extensive testing revealed no issues with the seawater-derived aviation gasoline. It looked, smelled, and performed identically to premium petroleum products. The success of Independence's deployment triggered accelerated implementation across the Pacific Fleet. Admiral Patricia Chen, commander of the 7th Fleet, requested immediate installation of fuel production systems on all major surface vessels under her command. The strategic advantages of fuel independence had become undeniable once operational testing proved the technology's reliability. Dr. Heather Willauer's seawater fuel breakthrough proved that sometimes the most revolutionary weapons aren't missiles or bombs, but the courage to challenge impossible odds. Her chemistry transformed naval warfare forever, eliminating fuel vulnerabilities that had haunted military planners for generations. Today, American forces operate with energy independence that seemed like science fiction just decades ago, all because one chemist refused to accept that petroleum dependence was permanent.